a few responders from within the community of Christ Church who are asked to look and to integrate this this information, this conversation into our own personal journey of faith together. So I look forward to hearing from Professor Lee, from Father Walter, as well as from our responders this morning. And I hope that this conversation is illuminating to all of us as we seek to shape a better union together, to shape and to form the beloved community in our midst. And so with that, friends, I'm going to invite Father Walter to open us both with a prayer and to introduce us to Professor Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Drew. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to first start with prayer, and then I'll do the introduction. A prayer for our nation at this time. Lord God Almighty, you have made all the peoples of the earth for your glory, to serve you in freedom and in peace. Give to the people of our country a zeal for justice, a thirst for love and compassion and understanding, trust in each other, and the strength of forbearance. And that those who have liberty may use it, and those who do not may gain it, that we may all employ it in the accordance with your gracious will, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce, if you haven't figured out after nearly 3 years, I get really excited when we get to talk to lawyers and talk about stuff that they say, I've never really quoted ex-lawyer. It's sort of like being a Marine. You can be a former lawyer, but like you can be a former Marine, but never an ex-Marine. But also, as I knew in seminary, where about 6 of my fellow seminarians in my cohort had been lawyers, we all had the sort of same experiences around our quest for justice, and ended up thinking that maybe through being ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we might achieve something that we didn't achieve at the bar. But our guest today is one who is an example, and for me, actually a role model of what being a lawyer can be in that quest. Brant T. Lee is a professor of law, and actually I'm going to call him Dean Lee. He is the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Social Justice Initiatives at the University of Akron Law School. Brant is a native Californian from San Francisco, graduate of University of California, Berkeley. For those who, I think some people in this Zoom room might say, go Bears. Graduate of Harvard Law School, where he served on the Harvard Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Law Review, and he was a research assistant to Derek Bell. And when at least African Americans who know the law and know legal scholarship, Derek Bell is like Thurgood Marshall almost. He is was the late Derek Bell is a great legal scholar, actually the founder of a school called Critical Race Theory, and his books, which combine not only his legal scholarship but his faith as a Presbyterian, has inspired me. And so Brant and I have met before in Cleveland. He's that's really a touchstone of this commonality for us. After his Harvard Law degree, Brant worked in law firms for a bit, and then he returned to Harvard as well to get a Master's of Public Policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He worked not only in private practice, but he also worked for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and he briefly served in the White House in the 1990s as Deputy Staff Secretary and Special Assistant to the President in the White House. And after 1997, he began teaching at the University of Akron Law School. I know this because this is a little bit of a commute, but Brant is a member of Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland, and is very active there. We first met when he interviewed me several years ago when I preached there, and it was a podcast, Dean's Forum podcast. He also serves our National Episcopal Church as a member of the Presiding Officers, that's both the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies Advisory Group on Beloved Community Implementation and the Task Force on the Theology of Social Justice Advocacy as Christian Ministry. He lives in Akron with his spouse, Marie B. Curry. I don't think she's a relation to the presiding bishop, but if I'm wrong, Brant will tell me. So, Brant, I'm turning this over to you. Please take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's always humbling to be introduced and hear all of that history. I don't know how all that history happened. I'll tell you that, you know, I started Harvard Law School when I was 4 years old, and that's how it is that might have happened so long ago. I guess, so again, thank you. I am here to talk about the Asian American story, and I'm pleased to do that. I will, you know, it's a little bit of an impossible task to, you know, try to cover Asian American. I'm going to focus a little bit on legal, right? Asian American legal history in the course of 20 or 30 minutes. So I'm going to do that by sharing a couple of stories, right? Some vignettes that intertwine my personal family story and the nation's story. But I'm really cognizant of the fact that you've invited me here on Martin Luther King Sunday. So we will not stick only to the Asian American story, but I want to make sure to spend some time connecting, right? All of these stories are always connected. They're always intertwined. And we sometimes silo them and we look at this story and this story and this story, but then we sort of have to remember like which of those things are happening at the same time. So we will spend some time doing that. And then also at the very end, I will comment on a couple of sort of more current applications, right, of all of these themes. Because what's going on right now, right, the current moment is so fraught, right, for racial issues. So let me start by, I have 6 short stories, all right? So, but my introduction to them all is to tell you again, I'm Brant Lee, right? And if you ask me where I'm from, I'll tell you that I'm originally from San Francisco. I'm a California boy. But when you're Asian American, you often get a second follow-up question. And the follow-up question is, where are you really from? And it can be kind of an innocent question in a way, right? You want to know more about me. And in that innocuous question, there's a presumption that I'm not really from here, right? If I say Akron or San Francisco, right? It's the presumption that I'm not really from here, and it also lumps Asian together as, right? I can't quite tell which Asian country you're from. And what I want to talk about today, one of the themes that ties all the stories together is how it's a central experience for Asian Americans, both to be lumped together and to be presumed to be foreign or exotic in some way, right? And with that exoticism comes a sense of being an outsider. And therefore, in some circumstances, right, during crisis, not to be trusted. And I will confess that it can sometimes be useful to let people think that I have some inherent ancient wisdom, right? But Asian doesn't equal wise and serene and spiritual, right? We claim the right to be as dorky and distracted as the next person. And you know, when you think that Asian means foreign and exotic, you can make mistakes, right? Like the guy who got the tattoo that said sesame chicken. But sometimes it means that Asian Americans don't get to be considered fully American. So here's the first story. In March of 1999, the New York Times reported that China was developing nuclear weapons based on information stolen from the United States. And the suspect was named Wen-Ho Lee, who was a Taiwanese American scientist who had been a citizen for 25 years. And there was a congressional committee. Wen-Ho Lee was fired. There was a congressional committee that issued a report that described a vast conspiracy over the course of 30 years by which the Chinese government has carefully analyzed tiny bits of information from thousands of sources to piece together a picture of America's nuclear secrets. And among the conclusions of the report, that there are 3,000 Chinese front companies in the United States that might be surreptitiously collecting national security data. And a front company was defined as a corporation set up outside China by a Chinese individual to accumulate or raise money for personal use. And one of the examples in the report was a restaurant owner, right? So all of those Chinese restaurants, potential Chinese front companies. And the report said that Chinese tourists were likely spies, that Chinese students could be used by Chinese intelligence agencies, that Chinese immigrants could be sleeper agents who could be used at any time but not be tasked for a decade or more. And the former head of CIA counterintelligence said, and this is a quote, right? The Chinese do not think in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of decades. They are an ancient civilization. And I'm reading that thinking, but I also know all the words to the Gilligan's Island song. Like what's the connection to me? So yeah, I could go on about this. The chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence said on Meet the Press that the Chinese are very crafty people. And the implication of all of this, right, is that any Chinese person in the United States, no matter how long they've been here, is a potential spy. And in light of all of that, I always feel compelled to reassure my audiences that I am not a spy. But you might well think, if I were a spy, I wouldn't be telling you. And all I can do is ask you to believe me, because it's pretty hard to prove that I'm not. Story number 2. In 1854, the case of People versus Hall, California Supreme Court faced with a white defendant who had been convicted of murder on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. And there was a statute in California that said no black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. And the court first argued that Chinese must be Indians because Columbus thought that he had landed in India or in Asia, right? And then they said, scientists think that Native Americans crossed over at some time from Asia, so maybe Indian is like a generic term for all Asians. And then they said, well, the term black could be a generic term for anybody who's not white. And finally, the court just throws up its hands and says, well, as a matter of public policy, if we admitted the testimony of Chinese people, we would have to admit them to all the equal rights of citizenship. And we might soon see them in the polls, in the jury boxes, on the bench, in our legislative halls. Right? This is an actual and present danger. That's what the court says. And you might be wondering, well, why are all those things so scary? And the court tells us, right, that the anomalous spectacle of a distinct people whose mendacity is proverbial, right, for them is claimed not only the right to swear away the life of a citizen, but the privilege of participating with us in the affairs of government. And my point here is not to dredge up old offensive racist language, which is easy to do, right? I'm focused on one word in particular, right? Whose mendacity is proverbial, right? That's deception, a propensity to lie. Story number 3, my great-great-grandfather immigrated from China in 1855, 1 year after the decision in People versus Hall. He was 12 years old. Actually, let me see if I can do this. I wasn't necessarily planning to, but a few minutes before. Can I share my screen? Yes.
You're a co-host, so I think you can.
I am a co-host, so I can share my screen. Well, let me share this then. And turn this to a slideshow. So we're going to view. No, slideshow. We're going to play from this slide. Right. So are you seeing this picture of my great-great-grandfather, Bo-Duk-Gum?
Yes.
Yes. So that's our picture of him. He, this is the only picture we have. And the only reason we have this picture is that in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that barred the immigration of Chinese laborers. It was the very first federal immigration law, and its purpose is racial exclusion. And because Chinese merchants and students and laborers who had immigrated before the Exclusion Act were allowed to stay or to re-enter if they left, the resulting scenario was that some Chinese residents were legal and some weren't. And my great-great-grandfather was legally present in California. But now you have the situation in which authorities seeing a Chinese person on the street can't tell if they're here illegally or not, right? So in 1892, Congress passed the Geary Act, which extended the Chinese Exclusion Act. And they actually argued on the floor of Congress that all Chinese names and faces are alike. And for that reason, we had to have a registration requirement. And my great-great-grandfather had to have a certificate of residence. And that is where this picture comes from, right? This is the certificate of residence that my great-great-grandfather had to carry around with him to prove that he was able to stay in the United States and was not an illegal immigrant. So let me, actually, that is not, let me stop sharing. Let me see how to make sure if I know how to do that. Stop share, here we go. So the resulting scenario, the interesting thing is, first of all, I'm glad we have it, right? It's the only picture we have. He'd been in the country for 39 years. There's actually some scholars that say this document is the origin of the passport. But this is maybe the ultimate expression of official distrust, right? That he had to carry the document around. I'm not going to go into any detail comparing this to what we've been going through recently, but I'll just note the overlap, right, between enforcing immigration law and racial exclusion has existed for a very long time, right? Here's story number 4. My great-grandfather on my father's side, other side of the family, his name was Lim Dick Young, and he immigrated to California around 1910. It's not clear what his immigration status was because he might have come as a merchant or a scholar who was exempt from the Chinese Exclusion Act. But apparently he could not obtain legal immigration status for his oldest son, which is my grandfather, Lim Gui Him. And one of the documents that we have for my grandfather, also an immigration document, right? It's an embarkation certificate with his picture, right? But the name on the document is not his name. It's not Lim Gui Him. It's somebody named Li Ho. And at the bottom is his forged signature that also says Li Ho. And there was a practice for people wanting to immigrate from China, despite the Exclusion Act, right, of purchasing papers from people who were allowed to enter. They were called paper sons. And all the official documents show my grandfather's name as Li Ho. And his children's birth certificates all show the family name, not as Lim, but Li. And so does mine, right? Am I really a Lim? I do have a Chinese name that starts with Lim. I've gone by Li all my life. You know, the tradition of giving children their father's surname, that's just a patriarchal convention anyway. So I consider my name to be Brant Lee, just like it says on the program, but the irony is that it's the racially exclusive immigration law that meant that my grandfather was required to be, in fact, a liar, right? It makes the prediction true, right? Actually, I'm gonna skip down to the last story because I'm conscious of time. And I had to add this because of our location here in Michigan, and that's the Vincent Chin story. I don't know how many of you may know the Vincent Chin story. 1982, Vincent Chin was a 27-year-old Chinese American having a bachelor party at a strip club in Detroit. Right, this is a little, you know, in 1982, I was a student at Berkeley, right? This person was just a little bit older than me. Got in a fight with Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz, who had worked in the auto industry, and Nitz had been laid off. And at one point in the bar during the fight, Ebens said, "It's because of you little MFs that we're out of work." That remark was about the Japanese auto industry, but Ebens and Nitz were not very carefully distinguishing, right, the Chinese Vincent Chin from the Japanese competition. I guess they did not stop to ask, "Where are you from?" Right. Anyway, the fight continued outside, where Ebens and Nitz chased Chin and his friends off with a baseball bat. So they were separated. But then they decided to go look for him, and they searched for 20 or 30 minutes until they finally found him in a parking lot. And they beat him with a baseball bat until his head cracked open and he died in the hospital. So lumping agents together and presuming foreign loyalties got Vincent Chin killed, right? They were allowed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter, and the Wayne County judge sentenced them to no jail time, 3 years probation, and a $3,000 fine. And this case got national press. Asian Americans around the country protested. I remember hearing about it at Berkeley. The judge responded that, here's the quote, "These weren't the kind of men you send to jail." What I want to do, so there's a sort of a really like through vignettes, right? Sketch. I've left out a ton. We could talk about the Japanese American internment. But in every instance, there's this common thread of being presumed to be foreign. And it doesn't quite matter how long you might have been here, right? What I want to do now is take a minute to put all of that history in the context of the rest of the American narrative about race, right? So let me go back a little bit, having sort of walked through that century and a half really quickly, but then go back. How far? So Louisiana Purchase, vast opportunity for national expansion, right? And in the race context, right, understanding that the economic logic of how slavery and cotton worked was that cotton had to expand and slavery had to go with it, right? Which is why you get all the conflict over which states slavery was going to extend to, right? During the same period, right, this is in the national narrative that you and I might have learned at school, right? This is the era of manifest destiny, and America is expanding across the continent to kind of form the foundation of the great nation that we would become, all of which, has this element of truth. And what that involved was moving Native Americans out of the way, right? The invasion of Texas, if you recently read about, in the Ukraine where Russia sent in troops, but said that they weren't troops, and then said that they had to enter because they were needed to protect the Russians who were in Ukraine. That just reminded me of, in the history of Texas, right? Private citizen Americans came in and declared the independent nation, independent sovereignty for Texas, and then we promptly entered into a war with Mexico, marched into Mexico City. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, is how we acquire California and the Southwest, right? And that's in 1848. And then the gold rush is in 1849. This is all leading up to the Civil War, right? So that's just this, right? So I only mention all of that to say that's the part of the story where my great-great-grandfather arrived, right? America is heading towards a civil war, right, over slavery. And the Chinese Exclusion Act happens in the 1880s. That happens as Reconstruction has ended and the beginnings of Jim Crow being imposed, right? So during this period, with brutal lynchings and white mobs in the South, that's the period when Chinese towns in the West are being attacked and wiped out, right? Between 1849 and 1906, there were 200 events where Chinese were purged out of towns and cities in the West. They burnt down entire neighborhoods, right? So this is a period of racialized private violence in more than one direction, right? It's an atmosphere of racialized private violence, right? Including, by the way, Sicilians, right around the turn of the century, being lynched by a mob in New Orleans, with the New York Times editorializing this is perhaps an appropriate response to their barbaric behavior, those Sicilians, right? So to capture the environment of the time, right? A little bit later, 1920s and 30s, Asian people are being excluded and prohibited from owning land, not allowed to become citizens. Latinos, some of them US citizens, are being deported en masse, right? African Americans are being lynched during this time, over 4,000 lynchings, right, occurring, and started to stream northwards, right? The Great Migration. I learned in school that the Great Migration was about seeking jobs. And what we've been learning more recently is that the Great Migration was, at least in part, fleeing a reign of terror, right, in the South. Those are not all independent events, right? followed shortly by Indian tribes being terminated or removed in the 50s and 60s, which brings us all the way to the civil rights era. Really connected stories. Let me just quickly mention, and I want to leave a good amount of time. Bring us to the present, and I need to mention a couple of things. Both of them having to do with Asian American merchants, because I think that's turns out to be an interesting prism. So two stories about that. One of them has to do with the Black Lives Matter marches and the George Floyd, in the wake of the George Floyd incident. And you may have seen a lot of footage of property being destroyed, commercial property in particular. And I have to say that I was a little bit gratified to see that often the merchants who were Asian, I don't have any statistical analysis of this, just happen to have seen a couple of instances, were quick to speak up and say that that they recognized that their property could be repaired and restored, but that lives could not, right? And sort of not in the space of condemning the violence. And the second current event I just want to draw to your attention in this context is with regard to COVID-19. I have a close friend, actually, Dr. Russell Jung at San Francisco State, he's a scholar of Asian American Christianity. He, as it turns out, he was my best friend in high school, and we were in each other's weddings. But he has coordinated an effort to collect reports of anti-Asian violence related to COVID, right? And this isn't the result of some high-profile people choosing to emphasize the origins in China of the virus, right? Calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. And the predictable result, given the presumption of foreignness that is already there and the lumping together that is already there, the predictable result is violence against Asians. And so he's collected over 2,500, a report, right, with over 2,500 incidents of children being spit on, old men and women being shoved and knocked over, taunting, being told to go back to China, and more. And one thing that I want to particularly draw your attention to in that context is the instances in which the name of God is invoked in the course of these racist assaults, right? So here's one particular. There are a number of these, but there's one particular. This was a letter to the editor that was printed in Boston, that says, thousands of our factories and millions of our jobs have gone to China without anyone willing to stop it. The times we had great presidents like FDR who knew what to do after Pearl Harbor are over. There's no Harry Truman on the horizon. Not even our great President Trump will retaliate as Truman would have done. God bless Mr. Truman. He was made out of the right stuff. So we're blessing Harry Truman for what he knew to do in retaliation, which, if you're a student of history, you know that what Mr. Truman did in retaliation for Pearl Harbor was to approve the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is invoked invoked in God's name, right, as a positive model for us to respond to current times with. I will say we should go to questions, and I'm sure that there will be some, but or I hope that there will be. I will just note that we have been witnessing and reflecting, I think, since last week on what happens when a mostly white group of protesters protest. And I will just note that this is, much of the history that I've talked about involves white people protesting with government at various levels of sympathy for it, right? Either complete conscious complicity and active participation, or just sort of neglect, right? Looking the other way and allowing it to happen. And there are stories in the Black community like this sort of throughout every part of every part of those periods, right? There are times when, right, people trying to desegregate neighborhoods, right, found mobs outside their doors with police only looking on as to what, or worse, right, as to what happened. And one of the most chilling aspects of what we're all learning about last week was the number of former military and current police officers who were involved in the storming of the Capitol. So there are ways to say, well, that's not the same thing, and it's not happening to the same extent. And I think that that's true, but I don't also think that it's to be watched, right? It's not clear to me just how far away what happened is from some of these historic events that we look on without quite understanding like what it would have looked like. And I think that maybe now we have a better inkling of what it might look like, right? For events like that to recur. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of that, or even if you have questions about some of the work that has been done in the Episcopal Church in those bodies that I'm involved on. I did not say anything about those. We could talk about those as well.
Thank you, Brant. Father Drew is going to run this. We'll chime in, but I want to first give Father Drew a chance to comment.
Thank you. Brant, what a insightful collation of American history in a really tragic way that we are very apt and often to shine a light on the beauty of American history, but reticent to look at its, shall we say, dark underbelly at times. And as a Native Hawaiian, it was really provocative to hear your story, 175 years of Chinese American history alongside of the Native Hawaiian story, which is running in real parallel to the vignettes that you shared, and so which I'd never put together in quite a as integrated or systemic way as you helped me to do. So first, just a thank you for that on a very personal level, to help and see my story in a broader context than I've been able to see it. There are two things. One, I very much want to hear where you left us, the next side, the other side of what are we doing as a church in response to this history, and particularly within the Asian American community. As both a Native Hawaiian and as a priest out of the Diocese of Hawaii, the work of the Episcopal Asian American, shall we say, caucus, that's ministries, has long been part of my experience, and so I'm not always as adept at sharing the good work and important work that's being done. So I think that would be really helpful for us all to hear. So that's an invitation. The other thing that struck me, and I think it bears repeating, you said towards the end of your remarks that the history that you have shared, the history of violence, the history of suspicion, the history of marginalization was not only a private matter, but one that was conducted with sympathy and at times complicity by both the American government and American society. Those two words, sympathy and complicity, stood out to me. That there are the overt the overt acts of violence and marginalization, yes, but there are the sympathizers and those who stand around who make those acts possible, and the critical role that sympathy plays within the perpetration of violence against others. I could bring Native Hawaiian history into that conversation, but I thought that comment of that this history was made possible with both sympathy and complicity was seminal to the history that we share, and a reflection of our role as a Christian society, as a Christian community, to choose where we will stand alongside the violence that others experience. Will we be complicit with it? Will we be sympathizers with it, or will we stand in opposition to it? I think is the third option in that. And I invite you to reflect more on what is our role as a Christian community in response to, is we may not be able to stop the violence in its entirety, but what is our role as witnesses to it? So two questions, long-winded questions, I apologize. But one is, what is our response as a Christian community in response to the violence that we see? And more specifically, what are we doing in the Episcopal Church? How are we doing within the Episcopal Church in this conversation, specifically within Asian American community and ministry?
Great questions, and there's so much to talk about, right? We could write books. On the active repression to complicity to sympathy, like, this is a spectrum, right? And that spectrum also goes with the nature of sort of government participation, right? Because I think at one end you sort of government is more likely to feel justified in taking public action that they're gonna explain why this is okay for government to do, right? Often in the context of either criminality or sort of alleged criminality, right? Assigned criminality. What's going on here is that these are criminals. That's why we're responding with force as the government, right? The state responding with force. Or national security, which is similar but in an international realm, and so that's why that hits Asians, because of the presumption of foreignness, right? So when it's about Asians, it's about national security, but it's the same sort of structure, right? And then the government is people, right? Government officials, police department heads, generals, right? They're people, and so even without an official order saying, troops, take care of Kansas City or whatever, if you think that the protests are correct and accurate in that these people are causing trouble and are out of control or can't be trusted, then you might well look the other way when the crowd arrives, right? And that's what happened often with lynchings, right? The sheriffs would turn the other way while the crowd got into the jail. Don't know how the door got left unlocked, right? Tulsa gets burned down, and not even the local papers, right? Not a single prosecution afterwards, right? So, like, how does all that happen, right, without some form of, even if not active, right, complicity, right? And so, sort of pretty fine line. You can sort of see that there could be a pretty fine line between action, looking the other way, and then the people, as you mentioned, who don't speak up, right, who don't say anything, who maybe just watch and say, well, I'm not sure, maybe there's good things on one side or the other, and it's very complicated, and there's all this cloud, all this fog being thrown up, and too much trouble for me to look into. And so, all I know is that maybe it's not hurting me so much. And, takes us straight to action, right? And I don't think I will need to sort of walk us through a theological defense of acting for justice, right? Although I will say that the task force on the theology of social justice advocacy has been grappling with the question of advocacy. I think a lot of people, ordinary, right, draw a line. They think of advocacy as politics. They think of advocacy as kind of dirty and lobbying, and I want to help people. I want to do justice by feeding individuals, right? Or in individual cases, which is such a sort of fabulous, sympathetic activity, but also misses an important responsibility that arises in part from the fact that we're a democracy, right? Arises in part from the fact that government responds to advocacy, responds to people calling for action. And so when what is happening is either the result of direct government action, right, with regard to the police, for instance, right, or the result of government complicity and not paying enough attention, right? Either way, right, that government will respond to people doing what I consider always to be advocacy, right? So to me, right, social justice advocacy is at the core of how I respond to injustice as a Christian, right? And advocacy doesn't mean that you have to call you have to do political lobbying. Advocacy can mean educating more people about why it is that certain policies need to change, right? So it doesn't have to mean marching in the streets with a big banner. Although, if the reason that you're not marching in the streets with a big banner is because you're afraid of how it will look or what the consequences might be, then I'm not sure that responds to the call that we have to be witnesses and martyrs, right? In certain circumstances. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it certainly opens up as a reminder that advocacy and involvement is critical, and advocacy takes many shapes within American society, and there are opportunities for us within that. Would you say more about what the Episcopal Church is doing as well?
It's kind of odd that I got assigned to that group, because while I have been, I was baptized in the Episcopal Mission Church in Chinatown in San Francisco, the True Sunshine Mission. But then my family left the church when I was a child, and I did not come back to the Episcopal Church until after I got married in the early 90s. And so as an adult, And I have not actually been involved in the workings of the Episcopal Church. I have not been to General Convention. I have not been, right? I've been on vestry, but that's kind of the extent to it. So I kind of came to those bodies as a lay, perspective. But having been on it, I can report, right, that the presiding, the advisory council, our work has been, and I've been working with people who are much more knowledgeable than me, but I've been gratified to see, right, our work has been as a result of at the direction of the last General Convention, right, we had a pretty big pile of money to allocate to projects, right, and so grants, we've been making grants the last couple of years to individual parishes or dioceses or church bodies who are doing important work in the work of racial reconciliation, right, becoming beloved community. And that work started before the summer of protest and also before COVID. And during that time, we shifted gears, and the second round of grants was specifically for quick actions for churches and parishes that wanted to do something directly in response. And so I have had the opportunity to see the applications for grants, and many of them granted, right, of places that are doing great work, right, both in a lot of different ways, right, and some of them are more internal, sort of exploring the history of your place and your church, and because all of that history, right, you look at your own church's history, and then you look at all of that history. And again, none of them are ever separated. And I never say this to say, oh, you should feel bad or you should, but also, but to look with open eyes, right? To see that people can do good things and bad things, right? That people at the same time, and sometimes that's like, you can be a founder of the church and a founding donor to the church, and have been involved in industries that were perfectly reputable industries at the time, but we now, looking back in hindsight, right, understand that industry was, right, founded on the exploitation of exploited people. We can look at that with both, kind of pride and humility, right? It's like people doing their best, very human and flawed as we all are. So some of them looking inwards, some of them doing great things and interacting with communities, right? It is a weakness in the Episcopal Church that the parishes themselves are not, for the most part, right, do not have within them already, right, the diversity to sort of encompass and embody the good work, rather has to sort of reach out and try to find it, right? And with regard to the Asian American, that group, I really don't understand within the Episcopal Church, but I am actually a little bit more connected with the sort of Asian American Christian communities, more broadly speaking, which tend to be a little bit more evangelical, actually, tend to be a little bit more on the, so many of my friends growing up went to sort of fundamentalist churches. But Asian American fundamentalist is a little, right, it's a different flavor. Then it's not sort of based on white Baptist, right, preaching or that kind of thing. But it's a interesting subculture itself, and they are speaking up in different ways against sort of, it's actually white Christian nationalism, right, that they're actually a little bit closer to and speaking up against.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for that, Walter. I'd love to hear your thoughts and draw you into this.
Thank you. First, Brant, thank you for that. I always love the history and even the what resonated, but three things resonated with me very briefly. One is that 19th century, mid-19th century, there is, yes, as Father Drew said, there's great glory and pride in part of our American history, but our story is also deeply shadowed. In that mid-19th century, things just didn't start going awry in a vacuum. It, of course, goes back to the arrival of the first Europeans, whether they were Spanish, French, or English, or Portuguese, or Dutch. But in the mid-19th century, it seemed to come together. As you said, cotton and slavery there was pressure to expand. There was a need for labor out west, which tended to come from Asia and particularly China. And that this whole idea of manifest destiny, then, the purchase, quote, purchase of land that were already occupied by other people. So, one European nation selling to America land that they didn't, as we know in law, it's not clear title, but nevertheless, they sold it, right? All of this comes together so that genocide, slavery, and exploitation come together. And then again, Reconstruction, I happen to think that the Chinese Exclusion Acts were partly designed as America had struggled around what to do with these Africans in America, and now they were free, that they did not want to have a corollary problem with Chinese. And so, we need to just kick them out. After their labor is complete, the railroad is complete, or whatever other infrastructure, we need to remove a, quote, problem. The thing is that history, and I had a conversation the other day with someone that said we can't change history, but history, and this was the mayor of a small Ohio town, but history shapes what we have today, and so we do need to confront it. And while the circumstances of Vincent Chin's, why these men attacked him and murdered him, had to maybe do with, a combination of economic anxiety and racism, there is no doubt when you talk about a judge making a decision that they were not the kind of people you put in jail. I'm kind of like reeling from it, because I knew a lot about Vincent Chin, but I did not know the judge said something like that. I mean, that's just, as one, like you, as clerk for a judge, that's kind of like staggering, So, I think we need to, as I've tried to, lamely do this morning in the sermon, we need to lament some of that history in the present and know that it, it shapes. I mean, the reality of it is when Ho Lee, after being charged with 59 counts in an indictment, and because there was some history that he had conversations with foreign scientists and also conversations with Taiwanese American scientists who were maybe suspected, but there was never any evidence that he actually traded secrets or whatever. But the kind of almost profiling he had from the beginning, starting in the 80s, when they ended up charging him later, the case falls apart. And ultimately, as one who used to handle classified information, he pled guilty to settle this for mishandling of sensitive material, which essentially was like he gave his kids his password to his computer so they could, send email. But he did not trade secrets to China, whatever. But he ended up pleading guilty. Bill Clinton apologized for it. The judge in the case apologized for the Justice Department's treatment of him. The press, which really jumped to it, he got a $1.6 million settlement from, I can't recall who, for the fact, I think it was some government officials who leaked his name to the press. The Wall Street Journal, maybe, or the New York Times, or both leaked it. So but it was, again, that's a present day situation, or, the last 30 years, because of this profiling and what, and this is my last point. And I think this is the theological point, because our baptismal covenant says we should respect the dignity of every human being, whether you are Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander or Chinese or Japanese, African American, indigenous. The problem of whiteness is that and this is not a word, but they pathologize one's race or ethnicity as a problem. You're devious or deceptive, lazy, alcoholic, prone to sexual promiscuity. I mean, these are just stereotypes, but this is what is used to justify, to be blunt, whiteness as being the superior race. And that if we can't, and while we would today say, no, we don't believe that, I think there is this, for example, we have not talked about it and we don't need to go in this much. There's much about Asian community being the quote model minority. They quote value education. That is great and I love it. But no one valued education more than my Black parents who grew up in Mississippi with education was denied. But even my father thought that I should observe what other ethnic groups were doing. But it's just that in my view, and this is what I think you said on some levels, keeping a low profile, is that the desire to be American, whatever our race, the Buffalo Soldiers killing Native Americans to be accepted as American, other groups not feeling they should protest because they don't want to get attention taken to myself. To me, the great pride is to hear and joy. Last summer in the protest, there were a number of young, Asian Americans who were like my son's friends from school in Hawaii or in college. They were out there marching. And not only that, they would write letters to their parents and grandparents saying why they needed to do this. Because, it's their fight too. And they were really, on this weekend, we celebrate King. They understood the quote that King said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And so when they come after an Asian American, I know that they could come after me. And I think you would understand the same thing. When they come after, Father Drew growing up in Hawaii, the same stereotypes, they would talk about Black people in the South. They would talk about Native Hawaiians. And it's all pathology that poverty and so on is their fault. So theologically, we have to, I think, break through to get people to say, what does it really mean to respect the dignity of every human being? Is to move beyond this stereotype.
Hey, thank you for those observations. Really provoking themselves, right? I want to respond to two things. The whole rest of the Wen Ho Lee story, right? Lots more to mine there. But I have this particular observation about Wen Ho Lee, which is that if you think that this scientist who had been an American citizen for 25 years, had been in the country for 40 years, right? If you think that first of all, it's not obvious why a Taiwanese American would be spying for the People's Republic of China, right? So there's a central misunderstanding in making that claim, but not natural, not natural sympathy. But if you think that he did that, then I would have liked you to call him a traitor. Rather, like he was being accused of being a spy. It's only foreign people that are spies, right? If he was seen as an American, he would have been a traitor. But nobody said this is treason. No one said this American is betraying his country. People said he is essentially this person who's been here for 40 years, right? Essentially Chinese, right? And spying for China, right? So, there's some kind of paradoxes there. And the other thing you mentioned that I wanted to follow up on is the model minority. And let me read you some, statistically, Asian Americans do very well. So when I talk about some of this history, this is not a lament about how oppressed we are, right? We, statistically, on average, right, median households, more wealth than white people, more higher incomes, more education. And so, to be called a model minority is in some ways right? Not a surprise. And two things, well, a couple of things to say about that, but one of them is that because Asian Americans are being all lumped together, right, that statistic covers a lot of diversity, right? So, you know, within the category, the median incomes for Indian from Asia, right? Indian Americans, right, is the highest. They're over $100,000, but for Burmese Americans, it's a third of that. And you want to recognize that some of these groups immigrate as professionals, with graduate degrees, and they're coming here as engineers and doctors. And there's discrimination happening where, you know, they come here and sometimes they work as janitors, but they come with all of that background, and whatever cultural capital it took for them to get there, they're bringing with them. And some of them come from hill tribes in Thailand where they were barely literate or not literate, right? With no plumbing, and they're trying to deal with settling in America and figuring out how this toilet works. Like, what is this toilet and what is it doing right in this room in my apartment? And so like really vast disparity of experiences within this umbrella, right, that we're calling Asian. And, you know, part of what I just said also explains a little bit of the inappropriateness of doing these comparisons, because the model minority thesis doesn't arise in a vacuum, right? I couldn't be prouder of the achievements that Asian Americans have accomplished, and they happen for lots of reasons, right? But to say it's a model minority, there's like, who are we a model for, right? Model minority first comes up as a Time magazine cover article in the 60s. What's happened in the 60s? It's the civil rights movement, and Black people are protesting in the streets. And the model minority thesis comes out and says, look at Asians. They're doing so well. They've also been discriminated against. They're not protesting. They're not burning anything down. Why don't, right? The implicit suggestion is, why don't you be more like them? And every 20 or 30 years, I feel like you get the same article, but you get the same, oh, look at this. He was a refugee from Vietnam, and now he's a valedictorian at West Point. And sometimes more explicit, sometimes less, right? But often offered in the context of a race discussion that's happening, sort of, right, more broadly. It is true, and I won't, you know, so when, just as I said, you know, when you look at those numbers in Taiwanese Americans, if you separate out among Chinese Americans, right, Taiwanese Americans, very high, you know, in education and income, no doubt they bring with them, you know, education as a value and so forth. And no question that China as a culture, right, you know, Chinese culture idolized bureaucrats. They thought that was a high level, high status achievement, right, in ancient China. They are like, so there's no question it's a culture that views certain kinds of learning in a particular way, right, that you might think, well, it's not as prevalent in America among any group, right? So yes, does some of that culture help, right, people to achieve? But whenever that question arises, I always have to think, well, so are you suggesting that people adopt another culture? Are you like, the culture has antecedents. Culture doesn't just, we don't choose, right, to have the culture that you know, to the extent that it has effects in these almost sort of unconscious ways that I don't even realize that are having that effect. And then years later, I realize, oh, you know what? That's kind of like something my father used to do. and you know, it pops up, but it's not as though I could teach people, right, to, I would recommend having had that experience as a child growing up. That's why, could you have my father as your father while you were growing up? I think that's what you should do, and you would do better if you did that.
Well, it's for a lot, yeah, and a lot of Black folk here, you just quit complaining and be like the, you know, Chinese, or you know, and you would be fine, or like Jews, you know, whatever, you know. And, you know, there's John Cho, I think the actor who grew up in Houston, Korean American. The pandemic, he wrote a wonderful LA Times piece in the pandemic because of the racism coming up, because of the virus. And, you know, it's quote China, but then he's Korean, but, you know, still, again, people still can't say they can't tell apart. And he said that idea of model minority and our acceptance in American society is conditional. He was making that point. It was fine, but now, you know, we're going to blame, you know, China and Asians have caused this problem. And it goes to the core that, as Derek Bell would say, the persistence of racism, that we should never think that we have conquered it or that it is not a salient reality. And that even if the finger is not pointed on you right now, metaphorically, if the knee of white supremacy is not on your neck, choking you to death, it's choking someone else, that could be you. And so you need to stand firm against it.
Yeah, you know, let me say one other thing, and maybe there are questions from others. Positive stereotypes are no doubt better than negative stereotypes, right? So, and the positive stereotype, I will tell you that I have exploited positive stereotypes, right? I play chess with my students, and they are scared out of their wits. They've lost before they started because they think I'm so smart and intellectual, right? Because, and I'm happy to rely on that. But sort of joking aside, positive stereotypes turn negative under pressure, right?
Yeah.
So closely connected families, disciplined, academic, clever people, right? All very positive things. And then when World War II comes around and we're at war with Japan, suddenly it's, oh, they're so close knit. They're so insular. No one knows what they're thinking exactly. And clever turns into diabolical, right? Clever is, oh, they could be planning all these things. And all of that, right? All of that was just the flip side of the same description that was positive like a minute ago, right? And can, you know, and can turn on a dime if the underlying sort of essential foundation of trust is not there.
Brant, I'm excited for this conversation and certainly have some thoughts that I'll throw in as we have an opportunity. But I want to bring in a few other voices into our conversation. We've had members of our community in the midst of our conversation. And part of the joy of bringing these responders in is it allows us to move, to engage not only the intellectual part of the conversation, but I hope also the emotional, spiritual part of the conversation. This is a conversation that is both inspiring, but also challenging to us. And so we're fortunate to have with us the Redfields, Dave and Jean Redfield and Sue Choklos. I believe we also had Lauren Clune, and Wendy Richards, although they may have had to jump off. But it's great.
Lauren is on an iPhone, so I don't think we can see her, but it's Lauren. Lauren is on the phone.
Hey, Wendy.
And Wendy's there too somewhere.
Great.
There we are.
Great. It's wonderful to have you guys as a part of this conversation, and no doubt you have some thoughts that you'd like to draw into this, and I would like to hear from each of you. I also want to ask you a particular question, which is, where has today's conversation been challenging, and where has it been hopeful for you? Where does this become not just an intellectual reflection, but also a personal one of challenge and hope, if you're willing to engage that side of the conversation as well. I'm going to start left to right on my screen, which may be center, right, left on your screen. I'm not sure. But it happens to be Dave and Jean on my left. So I'm going to throw the spotlight to you guys. Dave, Jean, where are you in this conversation? What stood out to you and what's been challenging and hopeful?
You guys are muted.
Unmute, Dave.
There we go.
I'm just trying to drive the mouse. That's even harder than
That's the challenge.
anything today. So here's something that just occurred to me a few minutes ago, and that is, how do we guard ourselves against like the superiority of the folks that showed up at the Capitol on January 6th? How do we keep from making those folks the bad folks? And we might really disagree with them. And as they say, how do we not let ourselves off the hook to love them when we might fiercely, crazily, intensely want to scream and yell about that? And that is, I don't know the answer to that. But those, and I'm not using those good people on both sides, because that was a goofy thing to say.
And it's also the idea of, once you start demonizing, I mean, what we're complaining about is demonizing the other, right? So how do we not step into that same behavior? You know, how do we engage differently than demonizing the other? Because frankly, I'd love to demonize them. I mean, they're wrong, they're mean, they're nasty, they're uneducated, you know, they're privileged. You know, those are all things that hurt us as a community. So, but as soon as I start calling them names and dehumanizing, demonizing, I'm in the same boat.
Boy, I feel like that is a core question for our times, for many faiths, right? Not just Episcopals or Christians, or like as human beings, right? If you buy into at some place in some way to the love your neighbor, you know, principle, that is a very hard one in these very polarized times. I would say a couple of things. And I feel like I speak with no particular authority on this particular question, but one of them is that part of the question is also self-care, right? So yes, you know, the topic is going to be, how do we think about them? How do we, right? But also go ahead and scream and yell, right? Maybe privately, maybe in a backyard, maybe into a paper bag, I don't know what, right? But sometimes you see things, people are crazy, you have to scream and yell about it, right? But then I think the question is a little bit more about sort of, what do you say publicly, or what do you say on Facebook, or what do you write, what do you say to other people? And so that's maybe like a slightly different question. And my other answer to that is that my own approach to teaching, this last semester I taught a course on racial equality in the law it was an open, free online course, and 5,000 people signed up. And I was very cognizant that most of those people, first of all, most of them are white, right? And many of them with very little background in, you know, some of this history and some of this. And our mainstream narrative about America does not emphasize a lot of these things. And my approach to teaching is always that you have to try to reach people where they are, right? And if where they are is not understanding why, you know, people would riot, right, then I need to figure out a way to take them from where they are to where they need to go. And that means that education about whiteness, right, is really key, because one of the core issues is people not being aware of their own racial identity and how that plays into the history and the environment, right? And now there's a very fine line here, because some white people who are becoming aware of their racial identity are the ones marching in Washington, right? They're like, I'm now aware of my racial identity, and what my awareness takes me to is we got to fight for ourselves, right? It turns into a kind of tribalism as opposed to a kind of acknowledgement of how one's identity has played into your development of your own personality and your culture and community. So as much background as I can provide about, I'm a relatively gentle presenter on these things, right? So I try not to present this stuff and saying, see how racist you are, right? I try to present this as, even anytime there's a large group of people who do something, I don't ascribe that to evil in a kind of way. I ascribe that to culture and socialization. And there's always a human element about why people do things. I try to focus on that and say, this is where our humanity led us astray, right? Because we thought we had to do this in order to maintain morality, in order to protect white women, in order to protect our economy. And once you start to recognize that in history, then you might be able to start to recognize it today, right? Because racism, people often say, oh, that's not racism. They're just expressing it through racism, but they're really concerned about economics. And my answer is, that is always what racism looks like. It is always protecting other things, right? It was, slavery was a huge percentage of the entire GDP during some of those core times. And whole economies were going to fall. And in fact, the South became an economic basket case for decades after the Civil War, right? They were fighting, and I went right in some ways for a good reason, and they suffered for losing, right, economically. So it's not obviously a good reason to keep slavery, but the fact that they expressed it through racism is what racism looks like. Sorry, that kind of went off on a tangent, but.
Next on my screen is Wendy Richards. So Wendy, I'd love to draw you into this. And again, what's grabbed your attention in our conversation, and what's both been challenging and hopeful to you?
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Lee. This is so nice to have you here. A few things, so much challenge. So much, it's overwhelming, honestly. One, and I'll just throw this out here and see how it may connect with why I really would like to speak, but the issue of white Christian nationalism, and you mentioned, taking to the streets and protest supporting values that we believe, let's say, but that same sentiment of being a martyr or witness used for what I would think an evil force. And truly being embraced by the other side is something that I'm deeply worried about, and I think is an enormous challenge for this country. And I also am very grateful that Tina and Walter provided some ways of trying to reach out, but that is such an inherent moral authority on their part, in quotes, that they feel like they're doing this because they have a higher purpose in doing so, that's going to be really hard to break through, and that really does scare me quite a bit. I probably was asked to come here because I'm an attorney and have done several matters relating to immigrants' rights. And so I'm very honored to have you here. This is wonderful. And one thing that I was really grateful for you saying today is this idea of like being an advocate where you fit. There are different flavors of advocacy. And all of us have our place. And I think all of us should look at this opportunity of figuring out where we fit best and where our special skills, all of us have unique skills, where can those be put to best use to make a difference? And so for me, obviously, as an attorney, that's where it belongs. But we've seen the courts be allies and also participants in this discrimination, right? And we see the ways, and we know the judiciary is looking very different, going forward, and maybe not as sympathetic to some issues that we may find helpful in moving forward in the courts. And yet at the same time, you see them as also being a bulwark towards like anti-democratic forces in this last election, and in some ways have been the only way we've succeeded in kind of tyranny against the majority type actions. And so there's this tension of like the courts being so great and being so potentially like, problematic, right? And so I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether you're seeing the courts and the lawsuits as being a potentially positive ally moving forward, or do you think that this could be potentially problematic? Like, how are you feeling about
Courts generally? That's the question.
Yeah, like using like the law and lawsuit, not the legislative, but like the courts as being a bulwark to some of this, being a barrier to some of these actions. And are you feeling confident? Are you feeling nervous? I mean, what are your thoughts?
So first of all, thank you for being an immigration lawyer. That is such
I'm not an immigration lawyer. I'm a civil rights constantly read that out.
Okay.
So,
Oh,
so no, I want to be clear. I don't do immigration.
I just
Yeah.
it's very depressing work these days because the law keeps getting worse. And so, you don't have very many avenues to advocate when you step up because like all the rules are against you, which is one of the huge limitations for courts generally, right? If the underlying law is no good, then you're bound, right? And we like them being bound, right? And I have to say that the courts as a cultural institution where judges feel obliged to follow the norms of being a judge, which is say to apply law, those have held up surprisingly well, right? All of those 60 lawsuits challenging election outcomes where judges of every stripe, including very recently Trump appointed judges, right, said, no, there is nothing here. And it would not take much, right? Just understand what is happening here, right? It would not take much for a judge to say, you know what, after I'm going to be a judge, I'm going to run for senator. I want to, right? And I'm going to toe this line and throw the results out. And the thing is that every time you push that envelope a little bit farther, then it's like, well, then maybe somebody on the appellate court is also thinking that. And maybe that's why we fought so hard over the Supreme Court justice. And at some point, the potential for it to flip is present, right? And so far, at least in this round where it really mattered, right, at the trial court level, it held up, right? So hopeful, in that way, the general culture of following the rule of law in the courts, right, is prevailing. Not so much necessarily in some legislatures, right, or among some legislators, but holding up. The other thing I would like to say is, what you were saying about, it is absolutely true that everything we say about, if you know that this is the right thing, then you should stand up. And people who were marching on Washington believed deeply that they were doing the right thing, and they're standing up. And they're doing what we say to do, right? And take risks, be a martyr, be a witness. They're like, I'm going to go be a witness. We're going to storm the Capitol, right? And we might, so we profoundly disagree on both the moral and factual premises, and that's why a lot of commentators, and this might feel really intellectual and legalistic, right? Talking about the real danger was when you disparage the press. The real danger was when you disparage the impartiality of the courts. Because once you don't trust, once it's easy to say, don't pay attention to the press and don't pay attention to these judges because they're just Democratic judges, then there's nothing that, you start to lose all the boundaries for commonality. Like, how can we agree on something if we cannot agree that there are some trustworthy sources, right? So it's always hard to fight about the sources issue when it doesn't feel like that itself is that important. But then when you get to push comes to shove, that's what turned out to have been important, right? The criticism of the media and the criticism of the, not that media can't be vastly criticized, but it's got to happen within some boundaries where you say there is in the end something that we can rely on in common, right? So it's going to be a long, slow path back towards more authentic communion with people whose factual premises have shifted so far away. But it's going to have to start, I think, with figuring out what, if any, facts we can agree on. So I don't know if that, there's so many things to talk about. I don't, but that's what I think.
I would love to bring in Sue. Sue, you've been patient in this conversation. I know you have some experience. I saw your comment reflecting Helen Santese's comment earlier. I'd love to know what has grabbed you in this conversation, and again, where do you find hope for us?
Well, I'm reflecting on the question you said, what is hard? What did I hear that was hard? And his comment that you meet someone of Asian descent and you ask them, where do you come from? And then the stereotypes that go with that. And I'm thinking here in Detroit, that I think frequently gets into our Arabic and Muslim community. And it's assumed, their dad's a terrorist, or they're being radicalized, or, and I'm sort of reflecting on my own experience and going, oh yeah, I do that, and also the comment of the model. I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan. And so when I was there in the 60s, the Asian students, they were taking the scholarships from everybody else, and they were so smart. And, I'm kind of, you really touched a core in me, of reflection on how I've been throughout my life. I'll be honest with you, I was very ignorant on the whole Chinese exclusion law, and went on to the American Experience PBS and watched their film on it last night, because I was like, what was this? And so I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you. Lexi, I do have a response to that. First of all, the spectrum of responses and how to interact with them is vast, because there's always two people, right? And so there's no, I just want to acknowledge, for a lot of these issues, there's no way to get it right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. If you say, it depends on who you talk to, right? If you say, where are you really from? There are some people who will very happily, oh yeah, I'm Japanese, and this is, and some people will say, what do you mean? I'm from San Jose. And how do you get that right? I think, I'm sort of describing the overall impact of getting that question a lot, as opposed to judgment on a particular person, right? Because a particular person, I always get where they're coming from, and it's usually a place of genuine curiosity and an attempt at personal connection, right? I just want to find out about your background. So there's no condemnation there, right? If both things can be true, this can be a genuine, authentic question, and also can have a cumulative effect, right? That is other than what you may have hoped for. And I also want to acknowledge my own bias here. As I've told you, I'm sort of a several generations Asian American. When I was growing up, because of the immigration laws didn't change till the 60s, right? The racial tinge in them. And so when I was growing up, most of the people that I knew were American born, right? And the chip on our shoulder is you assume we're foreign, we're not foreign. And then the immigration laws changed, and it started to be that all these Asian immigrants came. And immigrants, of course, have a different perspective on that question, because why should you assume I'm American? I'm not American, I just got here, right? And so for them, it's a very natural question. Yeah, ask me where I'm from and I'll tell you. In fact, why are you calling me Asian? Because there's no such thing, because I'm Burmese, right? And I never thought of myself as having anything in common with that country that we've been at war with for millennia. Right? So, why are you talking about us the same? It's only in America that there are Asians, right? In Asia, like they're not Asians. So, so suddenly, right? It turns out to be an okay question for lots and lots of people. In fact, now I have to check myself and say, oh, actually, the majority of the Asians you meet are foreign, right? Because the immigration patterns have changed so much, right? So, and when I go to Chinese restaurants in San Francisco and I try to order and I try to use a few words of Chinese I know, and the waitress responds to me with disdain and says, "Speak English," and I have to sheepishly say, you know, number 24, because my Chinese is just no good. So there's so many moving parts, right?
Well,
On this.
Yeah, I want to. So my stepbrother is works for the Library of Congress, and he is a Chinese economics major, and so he runs the desk and takes groups over. Well, doesn't anymore right now, to Hong Kong and China, and he's married to a woman who immigrated here when she got married from Hong Kong, and so we have lots of discussions, and there, there's a lot of pain with them right now because they can't go to Hong Kong. Her family's in Hong Kong, and she cannot go. Yeah. The risk will be that she will be arrested, her husband will be arrested, and it's just, it's, I don't know, it's so hard. So, but thank you much. It's just up in another whole area of history that I need to explore. So.
One of the beauties of these conversations, to your point, is the expansion of the American story.
Yes,
the expansion of our history and knowledge, to recognize that there is so much that we know and so much that we still have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of still having to learn, I'd love to hear, Lauren, from you. What has grabbed you in our conversation today, as well as where have you found hope or challenge?
What's grabbed me, just going through the history of Asian American or people from the Far East, I guess. The fact that, it was such a, they were looked at with such disdain, but what they were needed for building the railroads, and then they weren't needed anymore. And then also in today's discourse, we've basically demonized China in particular, because they are such a threat to our supremacy in the geoeconomic politics of our planet. And so there is this fear, which is what prejudice is it's overwhelming fear and wanting to fight something that we're afraid of. It has brought up feelings, I'm sure, in many people that Chinese are the enemy. We were kind of fed that, whether government likes it or not, the things that they say have a pervasive effect about how people view somebody. But in terms of looking at citizens or people that are walking around on the earth in this part of the world, I don't understand how one could say or think that the people that are walking around are spies or they're here to steal intellectual property, except for the fact that our government tells us that that's what China does. And when people hear comedy shows and they, for instance, my sons watch a show called South Park, and South Park basically makes fun of every ethnic group. But in particular, I remember there's this one show that was talking about China, and that the American boys that were living in South Park were pretending to use a Chinese accent. And their premise was, they wanted to infiltrate. They went to one of those P.F. Chang restaurants, that we have here. The premise, they go into the P.F. Chang restaurant and they're talking to the waitress or they're saying, this is how we have to find out, what they're going to do to take us over. And, the whole thing was, the one kid was making fun and saying, "We are Chinese people and we want to know what the secret plan is to invade America." And that was supposed to be funny, right? You know, they're just like making fun of the fact that we think that Asians are invading us, and Chinese in particular, and that all stems from the fact that we are programmed by our government to view them as somebody to be afraid of. That's what I've gotten out of it. And so we form prejudices, whether we like it or not. Stereotypes are, interlaced in all of our dealings in this country, from movies, if you watched any movies from like the 1930s and 1940s, around World War II, and even into modern day, like we were talking about the movie Gran Torino yesterday, and how Clint Eastwood plays this character that was fighting in the Korean War, and he was really, he had some really bad experiences when he was there, and he came home with a conception of all people lumped into this one group of people that he was fighting against while he was in Korea. And so it spilled over into every other aspect of his life. So, it's pervasive. It's behavior and thought processes that need to be unlearned. And I don't know how you unlearn something that's been deeply programmed, other than to become educated about why you think the way you do, and then to deprogram through education of history and how it's brought into this current day, and how narrow-minded and limiting it is when we try to lump any group of people into a category, no matter who it is. So that's what I've gotten out of it. But I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that through time, and I was thinking even yesterday or a couple of days ago, I was talking to my son, and they've heard a lot from me because I've been part of this racial reconciliation group, and even before that, I've always advocated for minorities, just by talking to other people about how I feel about things. But my son said to me, he's 23, he said, this is all going to stop, from my generation down, Mom, because the kids in my generation don't see things the way you do, or don't see things the way your age group does. And so that gives me hope, because I think things are moving in that direction, at least in younger people's perspectives. I mean, even the advertising now is geared toward multi-racial coupling on TV. That would have been like, what, before? And now it's okay. Now, I mean, I see couples walking down the street in Grosse Pointe, even, mixed race couples, and mixed, white and black and whatever they are. And now it's not like, oh God, why are they with each other? Now it's like now it's not a thing of persecuting or wanting to persecute them. It's a thing of, what? Good for them. Good for them that they found a companion that they enjoy being with. So that's the hope. We have so much more to do, but that's the hope. I think that's why we look to children as our hope, because they are the hope that things will get better.
Thank you, Lauren. Friends, I'm immensely mindful of time, and as good conversations go, they spill well beyond our anticipated time, and I'm grateful for the conversation that we've had. But I do want to be mindful of the time and commitment that we've asked of everyone, including Professor Lee. I want to just offer a couple of things before we close out. One is, I just want to highlight two threads that have been woven into our conversation that I think demand our attention in the long term as a community and as individuals. One is the thread of our anthropology. That is the question of how we see one another, how we see our neighbor. Do we see them as we have said? Do we see the breadth and diversity that they bring, or do we only see a stereotype, a caricature of our neighbor? Do we have the ability to see the complexity that they bring, whether they are allied with us or standing in some way oppositional to us? Do we have the capacity as well to see them not as an enemy, even again when we stand opposed in some places, but do we have the capacity to see them as a stranger, yes, but also a potential friend and ally? How we see one another is a critical question of how we deal with racial discrimination, both acknowledging the history that our anthropology has been flawed, and recognizing that our anthropology must change. Another thing that Professor Lee, that I think you've woven into our conversation today for us to see more in starker relief is the role of economics in the issue of race and specifically racism and discrimination. That they are intimately woven together, and we have to be mindful not only of their interrelationship, but also our role in perpetuating them. Our commitment to an economy that supports my identity bears out in an economy and a society that discriminates against others who do not look like me. And so I'm grateful that those two issues have been as prominent in our conversation as they have been. I'm gonna come to you in just a moment. So yes, you may. Before, because I want to give Professor Lee the last word. So before I turn it over to you, Professor Lee, I just want to remind everyone of what is ahead of us. That next week we continue our conversation, our sacred conversations, and we turn our attention to the American dream, which is both a beautiful aspiration, but one that we have to recognize has had its limits within American society. And so we are fortunate next week to be joined by Professor Thomas Shagru, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at NYU, New York University, and author and editor with, as others will know, with deep connections here to Detroit. So I hope you will join us for that conversation as we continue our journey and our conversation together, these sacred conversations that we've been fortunate to have. So with that shameless plug behind us, I do want to turn it to you, Professor Lee, to offer us a final word, engage all that you would like. But one specific question: if there is one or two things, I'll give you two, that you want us to take away from today's conversation, love to hear that as well.
First of all, thank you all for asking me to join you. It's been a delightful conversation, such thoughtful people and such heartfelt responses. I wanted to leave you with a suggestion. This just came to me in the last minute in listening to people talking. And it's a suggestion that arises out of my own experience because, I grew up in San Francisco. I went to Lowell High School, which was the academic magnet high school in San Francisco, and Lowell was like 70% Asian. And then I went to Berkeley. Berkeley at the time was about maybe 25% Asian, right? And where are all the Asians? And then I went to Harvard, and I started to get this kind of a chip on my shoulder because I felt like nobody was seeing me. They would just see, oh, there's that Asian guy, and not even remember my name. And I realized one day that I was doing the same thing, right? I realized I was at the mailboxes. Somebody came by, they said, "Hi, Brant." I said, "Hi." And like 10 seconds later, I had no idea who it was. Some white guy Tom or Steve or Mike. Like, I don't know. And I realized that I had just done what I had felt like people were doing to me, right? I realized I had only registered that it was some white guy with one of those white names and right, not focusing on the person. And I started to do this thing that I have recommended to my students ever since, which is I started to do this race morphing exercise, which is to say, you know, in my childhood, I grew up with a lot of Asian faces. And then I look at white faces and I feel like, oh, they're all foreign, right, to me. And what you can do, though, is like, you can look at people's faces and change their race. Keep the hairstyle, keep the stance, keep the clothes that they're wearing and the furniture that they're sitting on, and just imagine that that person was the same person of your race, if there are someone of a different race. And I'm looking at all of you on the screen and I'm saying, I know somebody who's Asian who kind of looks like Susan, right? And with that sort of air and that kind of clothes, and I know somebody who's Asian with a haircut like Wendy's, and suddenly those people were more familiar. Suddenly it's, oh, that's like cousin, you know, Hugo. That's like Aunt Sue, like, and some of those barriers started to slip away, right? Some of those psychological, emotional barriers. And so if you're trying to fight stereotyping, you see an Asian person or a Black person, and if you can sort of do that exercise and see how familiar they might actually be, right? When you peel away some of the trappings, it can change your outlook a little bit. And I thought that might be a hopeful suggestion to leave you on. So thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you. And on behalf of all of us here at Christ Church, thank you for joining us. Thank you also to Father Walter for helping to organize our sacred conversations today and throughout the year. Thank you to Sue, to Wendy, to Lauren, to Dave and Jean for offering your voice and experience in today's conversation. And most importantly, thank you to everybody for joining us and giving us an opportunity to have these conversations together. So again, thank you all. Professor Lee, thank you especially for offering your insight and experience to us here across the lake, shall we say, in Michigan. So on behalf of us all, thank you and God bless to you.
God bless everyone. Take care.
Thank you.